and welcome back to my channel. So I'm going to be carrying on reviewing Naming Adult Autism from where I left off last week, Culture, Science and Identity by James McGrath. So as I was saying in last week's video, and unfortunately it did get cut off at the end, I was talking about how autism itself is a metaphor, making certain speculations on how autism is viewed from the outside, to do with the whole idea that obviously autos is Greek for self, and that suggests that autistics are somehow locked into themselves in this sort of very insular sort of self state, and how actually this is misleading given the intensity with which external factors such as sensory issues impact on autistic persons, so that they're actually not kind of, it's not so much that they're absorbed within themselves, it's that the outside world is too present, too overwhelming. So maybe autism is a bit of a misnomer, but that's debatable. And then, so yeah, carrying on with the whole sort of metaphor thing, McGrath also mentions the interesting use of the alien metaphor by autistics. For example, there's forums such as Wrong Planet, the Wrong Planet forum, which is one of the main autism forums. And as can be seen in the title, Wrong Planet, there's this implication of kind of being a sort of sense of being an alien on a wrong planet, which can be part of being what some autistic people experience, part of quite a few autistics' experience of feeling like an alien on a wrong planet. Let me know if any of you ever get that feeling of being like an alien on a wrong planet. I'll be interested to know. I don't know if I do feel like an alien on a wrong planet. I don't know if I do or not. But it's certainly you certainly do feel very kind of ostracised by the world. You sort of feel out on a limb, I guess. Definitely. And also, McGrath mentions how autism is often used a bit like a mirror by non-autistics. As a kind of, by that he means that autism embodies what is not, and I'm using big air quotes here because obviously this is, you know, I'm using it in inverted commas, but because obviously it's a problematic term. But that autism embodies what is not normal, whereas the idea of normal itself is vague and elusive. So autism is held up as a mirror, a bit like aliens are also held up as a mirror, to teach, say, non-autistics about what is acceptable or not acceptable behaviour. So in other words, everything that the non-autistic deems to be problematic or kind of outside of the norm can then be conveniently projected onto the other, whether that, say, be an autistic person, or whether that be an alien, or any other group of people, real or imagined, that kind of embody everything that, say, the majority deems to be unacceptable. Which I thought was quite an interesting sort of thing there that McGrath points out. For example, you know, many for society often kind of sends out the message that it's not normal to prefer solitude to company, etc. And then anyone who spends a lot of time on their own, maybe, you know, doesn't really want much company or is quite okay being on their own, society then often projects its own interpretations onto them, like, oh, they're not normal, they must have some problem, maybe they're autistic, maybe they're this, maybe they're that. I mean, they might be autistic, but they might just prefer their own company. But society always, it has this kind of need to kind of find an explanation for it. It can't just, it's not like happy with it, with that state of affairs. So the idea that autism is held up like a mirror, where the non-autistic society can kind of, you know, separate out what it sees as acceptable versus non-acceptable behaviour. It kind of needs the other. It needs the other to as a frame, as a reference point, and we've seen this all the way through history. I mean, doesn't just apply to autistic people, but I think there was going a bit off topic here, but there was actually a philosopher called Edward Said, who I came across when I was doing my university work, and he wrote a book called Orientalism, and in that book he talks about how historically when the West was in its kind of was seeking to conquer other countries, it created this sort of mythical idea of the East and the Oriental person as a sort of as a way of keeping at a distance, at arm's length, certain attributes that it deemed to be uncivilized or unworthy, and then it could project them onto this mythic other, which of course didn't exist. It only existed in the imagination of the Western white man. But it just made me think of that when I was reading this, about how autism has become a sort of similar kind of dumping ground, if you like, for everything that society deems to be unacceptable. But we've got a convenient other, the autistic person. McGrath mentions an autistic blogger called Caro Narby, and an interesting quote, so I'll read it out in full. She said, "We're not aliens, but we certainly are alienated by a culture that refuses to accept that we live, love, and relate to the world as human beings." I thought that was quite a powerful quote, because, the fact that autistics, we are human beings, and of course part of being human is that we're complex, multifaceted. We're not a stereotype. We're not, we're complex. We're a human being first and foremost, and that's the most important thing that people can forget when they just see the word autism. Because as soon as you see a word like autism, it's very easy for people to kind of have this very narrow vision of what that person's going to be like, a set of stereotypes, almost like a cliche, forgetting that actually, first and foremost, they're a human being with their own likes, their own dislikes, their own personalities, and no two autistics are the same, just as no any other human being is the same. And also he mentions on page 110 that amid the still increasing cultural emphasis that some autistic people can demonstrate talents, the distress involved with this way of being remains overlooked. So what you often see in representations of autism is that they foreground the special interests in certain topics at the expense of fully recognising the anxiety they bring, that these special interests, that while they can, in some cases, it is true, result in remarkable talent, but of course that is by no means the case for all autistic people, we mustn't forget, but it's true for some autistic people, because if you're spending a lot of time, say, on something you're very passionate in, it's possible for you to get very good at that area, and it's often in a very sort of narrow domain. But regardless of whether or not it results in a talent or not, these special interests, the underside of them, is a lot of anxiety because of the intensity, and I thought that was really interesting because I certainly experienced this. Special interests are a double-edged sword because they bring a lot of satisfaction, they bring a lot of pleasure, they are vitally important, and I'm very thankful and glad that at least I do have interests. I mean, I'd rather have them and be bored stiff or, depressed, So I'm lucky in that respect that at least I do have these passions that kind of make life worth living, but they do bring a hell of a lot of anxiety in their wake, and they can be very overwhelming because of the intensity of them. And this is actually to do with something called monotropism. Now, monotropism was actually coined in 2005 by some autistic academics, and this is the idea that in autism, the attention is preoccupied by certain objects, tasks and details to the exclusion of all else. It's mono. You're just focusing on one thing. It's one directional. That's what monotropism means. One directional, as opposed to polytropism, which is like a non-autistic way, which is more what non-autistics do, where you're kind of distributing your attention on lots of different things, and a non-autistic person might be interested in lots of different things, but they can kind of move among those different things without like focusing their attention 100% to a really extreme way on that one thing to the detriment of all else. Whereas in autism, the tendency is more towards monotropism. Bearing in mind this is a tendency, it doesn't mean that monotropism is unique to autism. There are some non-autistics who are also monotropics. It's just that, generally speaking, you're more likely to see this in autism than you are in non-autistics, as a rule of thumb. At least in a very extreme way, where it kind of takes over the person's whole life. It's what the lay person might just call obsessiveness, being extremely obsessed with something. Yes, and this of course can result in both pleasure and pain. It can result in extreme emotions, terror, ecstasy, rage and joy are some of the emotions that the graph mentions. And yes, I'm not very good at understanding emotions, but the extreme emotions, such as a sense of kind of like, extreme, that's what happens, because it's a state of extremes. Autism is a state of extreme anyway, in many ways. We don't do things by halves. It's either all or nothing for us, black and white, as people say. But it's very true, It can even be said to be almost like a meditative state or near religious experience at times. For example, the graph mentions the sensory joy of staring at fruit in a bowl, the sort of visual pleasure. Yes, I can relate to this. I did actually once write a blog on it when I went to a local town. This was obviously before COVID. And I went to this local town and I went into a gift shop, and there was not a gift shop, sorry, it's an antiques parlour. Yes, an antiques parlour, because I have a little bit of thing about old stuff. And I went in there and there were all these amazingly beautiful objects, and I was kind of completely overcome by this kind of almost sense of childlike ecstasy, which I had to kind of rein in because there were other people around and I didn't want people to stare at me. But when people weren't looking, I was like, I was like so excited because it's just like all these objects, and like I'm sure other people might get this at times, but I think in autism it's just more intense. It can be more intense because it's this whole I think it is to do with the sensory thing of like the visual, when something is very beautiful to look at and you see it more in an extreme way, it's kind of like more like a very intense kind of vivid thing. So I guess it's like that monotropism, yeah, and it can make you feel really hyper and energised. But obviously the underside is anxiety and overwhelm as well, because it can be just too much. Okay, so I'm going to move on to video number 2 now to carry on reviewing naming adult autism. So moving on to video number 2 now.